in the 49ers. So uh, let's transition to the 1990s. So who do we have for the 1990s? Our Mount Rushmore 49ers.
So I can go first for this one, and I'll admit I kind of cheated a little bit because I had three who were definitely on there, and then Jack, you kind of gave me my last answer because I didn't even consider it. But I'm gonna put Eddie DeBartolo on this list for the '90s, and I'll put him specifically on the '90s over the '80s, even though I just admitted to not thinking about him being on this right now. Because specifically, you look at that 1994 team, what he did to get that team put together, the money he was willing to put into the franchise then to take them over to the hump. To me, I mean, yeah, the hiring of Bill Walsh is super important, but that's one of the defining things of DeBartolo's legacy with the 49ers, that willingness to be all for the players, like Jack was saying, and to really transform the way ownership works, and not just only the NFL, but across sports. So you got to give Eddie D a lot of credit. I mean, yeah, really an exceptional owner. I mean, yeah, you said it. I think that's Korean 49er in the comments who's saying this. I mean, absolutely defined the gold standard for what owners should be in the NFL. And the next three guys I'm going to go with are, of course, you got to go with Jerry Rice, the GOAT himself. I think you guys probably have. I'm not going to pretend like I'm the most expert Jerry Rice person in the world, but here's what I will say about Jerry Rice real quick is I think he, to me, is like one of those guys, if you could go in a time machine and get his single game statistics for fantasy football, Jerry Rice would be one of the most popular NFL players in history because of how many people's leagues he would win. I mean, Jack, you yourself are smiling right now because you know about these ridiculous stat lines where it's like 220 yards, 3 touchdowns, 180 yards, a touchdown, all that crazy stuff. So and then the last guy on my list, I'm going to go with Ricky Waters. I feel like those three players are kind of the three obvious players that make the most sense for this list.
Okay. Yeah, so for me, I'm going to go Jerry Rice. Like I said, I didn't have him on the 80s. I got to have him on the 90s. Played every single year for the 49ers in the 90s, the greatest wide receiver of all time, probably the greatest football player of all time. So definitely has to be on the list. Bryant Young, this was a guy that was inducted last year, and we'll actually get to see it on the field for the 49ers Ring of Honor. So yeah, Bryant Young, to me, he was an absolute game changer along that defensive line. Great player, one of my favorites to watch play. Merton Hanks, this one I battled with, but Merton Hanks, to me, I mean, the chicken dance, and he was a difference maker as well. I mean, he was there for a majority of that. He held that secondary together for many, many years, was a very good player. And like I said, just because of the chicken dance alone, he has to be there. And then my favorite player of all time, the reason that I learned to throw left-handed, is Steve Young. So I have him, I believe, number 9 on my all-time list of quarterbacks. And just like I said, my favorite player, and obviously deserves to be on that 90s roster or Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, this is a fun one because we definitely have a little bit different view on this one, but I think we definitely all have some similarities. I have Steve Young as well. He's the first one because he was during his period when he's the 90s were his time. I know he had some plays in the 80s, but he took over in 91, and from 92 till 98, that period, basically the meat and potatoes of the 90s was Steve Young being really at the top of the NFL, just doing things that hadn't been seen before. It would have been nice to have seen him be able to get over the hump a couple of times to get in there and win the Super Bowl, but they had the Cowboys and they finally got over that hurdle in '94, and his Super Bowl game was one of the all-time best. So it's definitely Steve Young first. Jerry Rice, obviously, greatest of all time. I think one of the best football players ever. He's on the list, and I put him in the 90s too because same reason that Jesse did. I didn't want him to have him in two different eras there, so I kept him in that one. For my third choice, I went with Bryant Young. BY was an absolute beast in the middle. They had I think he came along the year before. I think they had drafted Dana Stubblefield, and once they went and got Bryant Young the next year, that middle, that interior, that defensive line really took off and just did really well. So those are those three. And then the last one, and this, I'm kind of glad that nobody went this direction because this is I get to be on my own on this one. I'm going with Jesse Sapolu as my fourth. And the reason I did that is Sapolu was just the rock and one of the rocks up front for the 49ers offensive line throughout the 90s. I think his last season was 97, might have been 98, but he was there. He started a couple of years in the 80s, 88, 89, but he was just there all the way through. Just a tremendous football player, tremendous offensive lineman. I think he was drafted in like the 11th round back.
11th round, yeah.
And for him to have the career that he had, I think you got to put him up there as well and give him that recognition I think he deserves for the career that he had with the 49ers.
Yeah, he was definitely a great player, and talk about value, 11th round pick, lifetime starter. I mean, yeah, very good player.
Yeah.
I saw some people say Deion Sanders, he was only there for 1 year. Definitely not putting him there for the 1 year.
I'm the biggest FSU fan. I'm going to put a harsh no on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a no just because you can't do it because it was only one season. I think he missed the first 2 games of the season or something like that. I like Korean 49ers though here with John Taylor. He's definitely
that's a good underrated one.
Yeah, he's an underrated guy. And last night when that call came down that he had made it, I went back because I had tweeted out some stuff earlier in the year about Brandon Ayuk. If the 49ers could have him be like John Taylor, they'd be good. And I got some pushback on that. And I don't think that there's a lot of people who really realize how good John Taylor was from '88 on. In '88 he didn't really catch the ball a whole lot. He was mostly a punt returner, but he did win the Super Bowl. And in '88 he had a punt return on Monday Night Football against Washington that really. At that point in the season, the Niners were struggling and really set them off to a path to get to the playoffs and the championship that year. Harold asks about Seifert. I struggle with George Seifert a little bit. He had a great career with the 49ers. My question is how much of that was because of the product that had been put together by Bill Walsh. The further he got away from Bill Walsh, the further it seemed like he struggled. I don't know about the two of you, but that was the reason why I left him off.
Yeah, somebody said Charles Haley as well, and I was this close to putting him on my 80s, but the way that his career fell, it was just so weird. He only had a few years in the 80s. He only had a few years in the 90s with the 49ers. He was mostly with the Cowboys during the 90s, so I couldn't put him on a 90s team. And he just didn't have enough years in the 80s for me to justify it. But as far as being an absolute wrecker and a game changer, I mean, to me, he's more of the reason the 49ers won a Super Bowl in '94. I know that Deion gets all the credit, but to me, it was Haley. And had they kept Haley and probably Waters and let Deion walk to Dallas, they still could have beaten Dallas, in my opinion.
Yeah. I just wanted to say one underrated executive who kind of I forgot about and then just re-remembered was John McVay. I think he probably doesn't make any of our lists, but I mean, a guy who was hugely important to the 49ers' success in the 80s and 90s, and obviously grandfather of Sean McVay. But I thought that's another interesting name if we're talking about non-football players that we were considering for this list.
Yeah, exactly. And then our good friend Walruna, I threw this up a little bit ago, but he says that Ben Henry Nayls should be the name of the show. That's actually pretty funny. I know Jesse was in the middle of talking when I first put that up, and that's pretty darn funny right there. So